let's cross the channel for an outsider's eye on all of this. Andrew Smith, lecturer at Queen Mary University of London. Thank you for being with us here on France 24.
Thank you. Cheers.
I have good news for you, Andrew. If before you went on vacation, you were worried that you might have to update your syllabus, it's not the case. We still don't have a prime minister.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? It's this sudden moment. The Olympic truce has been running. You've had this moment of real celebration, the summer holidays. And there is a real sense, I think, today of people getting back to work, of this kind of rentrée, the idea of going back to school, but also of politics needing to click back into action as well. And it's been quite extraordinary watching some of the kind of political coverage as these convoys arrive at the Elysee Palace. And it seems like you've got these suitors to the king suddenly talking about who will be given the reins of power. And I think there is quite a lot to kind of talk about there in terms of, what's going on and who controls this. I think, you've got Emmanuel Macron who's trying to remind people that there is no government without the president in France. Essentially, you've got this big game of musical chairs going on, but he's the constant presence at the centre of it and the one that controls the music. So I think he is trying to reclaim the initiative and reclaim the political centre stage at this moment when everyone is kind of re-entering politics.
Yeah, of course, the president did lose the elections, on paper at least. And in the past, you've had power sharing, what they call cohabitation in this country. And there he had to hand the reins to a clear leader of the opposition. This time around, he's taking his time.
Yeah, it's a challenging one. You have this odd situation. Of course, we know the Gaullist Fifth Republic is essentially set up in such a way that the public finds a majority. The French people create those majorities in the National Assembly, in Parliament. That's not down to politicians on the whole, that's not down to anyone. And in those situations of cohabitation you've mentioned in the past, there's been a fairly clear situation that says, OK, this party essentially won that election and they will govern. One of the issues we've had is in the last legislatives, if we actually talk about who won, well, really, the person that won was everyone that opposed Emmanuel Macron. And the difficulty is the largest party is an electoral alliance, the New Popular Front, of course, featuring this union of left parties, but also featuring the kind of far left in France Insoumise, France Unbowed. And it's one of the problems you have, as we've seen in recent days emerge. Of course, on Friday, Emmanuel Macron kind of symbolically considered their pick for Prime Minister. And essentially said, well, it's not going to work because it will be censured and vetoed effectively by the rest of government. It'll be voted down before it can ever sit. And so in his mind, he wants to protect the institutions. That's his claim, and find a candidate for Prime Minister who actually could survive that test of being censured by the Parliament.
Why didn't he just name the one that the largest bloc, as you say, put forth, let that candidate fall on its sword in Parliament, and then start again, give him a clear hand?
Yeah, it's a useful one, isn't it? Why not just have a go and see what happens? Essentially, the interview with Lucie Castet, the pick for Prime Minister from the New Popular Front Left Alliance, is a a former civil servant, left-oriented, but not necessarily tied to the politics of the far left. And it was seen that she was quite a good compromise candidate across the left-wing alliance. The difficulty you had is essentially Macron was trying to figure out whether the far left would have ministries under a potential Castet government. And she said, that's certainly something that would happen. They would govern according to the programme that was agreed by the New Popular Front. And that was the moment in which he called it. Now, controlling the idea here, controlling the timetable, the schedule, is the one thing that Emmanuel Macron really has at this moment. And he's tried to use this against the left a number of times. Of course, with the legislative elections, when he called them after his surprise dissolution, he kind of hoped essentially that the left wouldn't have time to unite. They did. He hoped essentially that the left wouldn't have, be able to come together and nominate a candidate for Prime Minister. And we saw, of course, there was a lot of ruction around that, but they did manage it. They did declare this was going to be the candidate they would support. And so it seems perhaps, again, like one of the ways he could potentially find a route through this crisis is by nibbling off support from the social democratic centre of the Parti Socialist, of course, on the right of the left-wing alliance, if you will, who he might be able to convince to support a different sort of candidate. And so this is perhaps him again playing with that timetable, playing with the schedule, and gambling that the kind of divides within the New Popular Front may be something that allows him to impose his politics on the National Assembly.
Of course, what goes around comes around. Macron was finance minister under François Hollande. The two don't get along very well, even though the former president was invited today to the Elysee Palace. Hollande's last prime minister, Bernard Cazeneuve, he's also had his words in the past with Macron. It was sort of a stillborn idea, trying to get Cazeneuve in as prime minister to divide the socialists.
It was, I think, a little bit, and it's a challenging one. It seemed for a while that this was the candidacy that might work. Like you mentioned, there is some kind of discernible difference. This wouldn't just be Macronism, but would be a kind of shift towards not kind of handing over the reins of power, as it were, but kind of giving up a little bit more space towards the kind of the centre-left of the Socialist Party. We know, of course, Hollande kind of re-entered politics during the legislatives. We've seen Cazeneuve say that actually this would be something where if he were to govern, it would be with an eye on what the people had voted for in the legislatives. It couldn't just be a continuation of Macron's policy. But there has been a lot of criticism of that potential. We saw some of that come, of course, from the far left. We saw, deputies of France Insoumise say that, this really would be kind of, beyond the pale, as it were. And we also saw Nicolas Sarkozy, of course, another former president who Emmanuel Macron spoke to, saying this represented what he called the dying gasps of Hollandism, and the idea that this was only a hearkening back to the past. And that, I think, is something important as well. Of course, he's had former President Sarkozy in to speak to, who we know is a kind of consigliere of the right, a very influential figure across many people in the centre-right. And, of course, Xavier Bertrand as well, another kind of candidate at one point to become the leader of the centre-right, and another prominent figure within that moment. It looks to me less like he would be having Bertrand as a potential pick for Prime Minister, because that would alienate so many other kind of rivals within the centre-right, especially Laurent Wauquiez, who's one of the kind of the big figures on the kind of the Republicans. So many internal divides there that it would seem a kind of not necessarily the best of picks immediately for Prime Minister. So more likely for me that he's speaking to the centre-right in Sarkozy and Xavier Bertrand and trying to see if they will stomach some of the candidates that he's likely to put forward for Prime Minister for them. Essentially trying this as a kind of focus group of former presidents, prime ministers and party grandees to see if those political families might accept the kind of figure he would put forward.
So taking his time, you mentioned at the outset that this is a constitution put forth by Charles de Gaulle in 1958. When the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, visited the Elysee Palace last week, was he visiting Charles de Gaulle's country, or was he visiting Napoleon Bonaparte's country? I asked the question because, as we said at the outset, it's first day of school, the high civil service is at its desk, the institutions are running. Your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a challenge, isn't it? Because, technically this is a moment where we are seeing sort of this kind of running stress test of the Constitution. We know there are things existing.
But it doesn't feel like there's a power vacuum, is what I'm saying.
Exactly, yeah. This is very much the idea that the Prime Minister, the Prime Minister at the moment, the outgoing Prime Minister, who has already tendered his resignation and is still hanging on in there, apparently at the Elysee right now, Gabriel Attal, was always seen not as somebody who was a figurehead, not as somebody who was the kind of the leader of the country, but more as really kind of using his former role as spokesperson for Macron's majority, but actually sitting there in the assembly. So, that seems very kind of Bonapartist, I guess. That's a useful way to think about it, perhaps. And it is really this idea of the Constitution being tested. We know there are limits on, for example, when the budget needs to be submitted. But are those limits of the Constitution, or are they part of the kind of organic law, essentially the kind of the practices and precedents governing how the Constitution is assembled? There may be challenges to that as well if there's a delay to the passing of a budget. And actually, we see the public reacting to this in quite a strange way as well. There is, of course, a lot of anger about what's happening and a question of legitimacy. Like you mentioned, that idea of what are politicians doing at this precise moment. But one of the interesting things is we see in some of the polling that's just happened, the ELAB polling that just took place last week or so, the idea that almost 67% of French people would support an idea of a technocratic government. And this seems to be one of the things that Macron is trying to push through, finding somebody, some figure that won't alienate too many on the left and too many on the right. And that's where some of those names have started to be kind of floated out there. We've seen in Le Monde today, Thierry Baudet, the president of the Economic, Social and Environmental Council, has been floated as another kind of potential candidate, with also somebody who might be a potential chief of staff, which makes it seem quite an advanced rumour, as it were. And that's the kind of figure who is broadly oriented to the left, came out against the far right, but is potentially the kind of person that could be accepted. Now, we know that France is not the Netherlands, France is not Belgium, France is not Italy. It cannot continue with this idea of a caretaker government, running current affairs and day-to-day events in perpetuity. France needs to find a figure in which they can actually believe, a figure who will communicate those policies. And, as you say, if there is to be democratic legitimacy for the parliament, that cannot simply be the president. He has a role. The parliament equally has a role. And that is something I think that is really up for grabs at the moment and actually needs to be defended. That legitimacy and that political role for the parliament is something that is absolutely crucial in this moment. And that's a big danger for what Macron's trying to do, playing this delaying tactic with the schedule and really risking the idea of the political legitimacy of the government itself. Long term, that type of kind of staggering caretaker government will only strengthen the political extremes and likely lead to a broader political unrest, as we've seen in previous years.
Andrew Smith, many thanks for speaking with us from London.
Thank you.
Stay with us. There's much more to come. More news, plus the day's business. And in sports, the latest on the Paralympics taking place here in Paris.